Hello, my presentation is called Capitalism and the Economy of Care. It will come in several parts. The first part is called protests. This seems to be the time of protests. The heart of Delhi was struck by student unrest due to the cannibalization of higher education. At the same time, as large crowds took to the streets of Chile's towns to stand against fierce cuts in social services and in the social wage. Not one country in the world seems to have avoided the plague of austerity and the revolt of the people. Two striking features of these protests should be noted. First, that women have been central to these protests, and issues that have become key to women are at the heart of the unrest. Second, these protests are part of a cycle of unrest that seems to erupt every few years, pushing back marginally against the destruction of social life, but then seems unable to move the needle of the class struggle away from money and towards humanity. Part 2, Contradictions. The age of austerity opened up about 50 years ago. Several points are important to highlight for the production of the age of austerity. Number one, technological. Capitalism, which has global ambitions, had been constrained by certain technological limitations. These limitations were overcome by the 1960s in different tempos. They include A. High quality telecommunication systems that have united the world in real time. And this, of course, refers to satellite technology. B. Computerization, which provided firms with the ability to manage complex databases and therefore to coordinate logistics. C. Efficient logistics and standardization. The arrival of containers for shipping cut down time for transportation and for distribution of goods. No longer did ships have to wait in harbors for several weeks as they got unloaded. A ship now can get unloaded in the matter of several hours. The International Organization of Standardization's stringent rules made it possible to source goods from any part of the world. This goes from grades for electrical cable to types of glass. Each of these have been standardized, and therefore, companies based anywhere in the world can basically source goods like electric cables from anywhere because of the now quite regular standardization of grades. That's the technological aspect. Second, political. Weakness of the USSR and of the Third World after the economic and political crisis in the Warsaw Pact countries and after the Third World debt crisis in the early 1980s meant that a challenge to capitalism in international institutions, particularly institutions regarding trade, development, and labor, dwindled. Over time, as the USSR collapsed and the Third World surrendered, hundreds of millions of workers were delivered to capitalist firms. This political weakness of the left allowed the capitalist firms and the Western countries to push for a shift in intellectual property. The understanding of intellectual property used to be that in old intellectual property regimes, it was the process for the manufacturing of a product that was patented, and which meant that you could reverse engineer the product, and other countries could produce, through quite important innovations in science and technology, they could produce the same goods, pharmaceutical goods. In fact, that's what allowed India's pharmaceutical industry to flourish. But after the last round of the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, which basically culminates in the World Trade Organization in 1994, once again after the collapse of the USSR in 91 and basically the surrender of the Third World Bloc. The idea of patent was changed. So now it's a product related patent, not a process related patent. What this means is that a firm that takes a patent out on a commodity is able to basically collect license fees, rent from anybody who produces this commodity anywhere around the world. So the second major shift about in the last 50 years was political, weakening of the shield against capitalism. Number three, economic. These hundreds of millions of workers whose ranks were, in a sense, expanded when China opened parts of the Pacific Rim to international capital, these hundreds of millions of workers competed with each other, allowing wage arbitrage to become a central aspect of the work of firms. Firms, for instance, would now look around the world. They had very good computer databases of pricing in real time in some cases. They could find the best price for the concrete labor that was needed by that firm in different geographical locations. The disarticulation of production allowed transnational firms to rely upon subcontracted manufacturing, which meant that these firms neither invested in production, so they had no equity in the game, nor did they take any risk. Disarticulation of production essentially means that the factory, this giant factory, would be broken up into various components spread across the world. Tires made in Malaysia, the chassis of a car made in Indonesia, internal components made in Japan, and so on. And each of the parts of the car would move along this disarticulated production to be put together in a different place and then sold. The key part of this really is that the big transnational firms essentially divested themselves of both equity and risk by having subcontractors in Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, and so on, invest in those much smaller components for the production of the car. Subcontractors rarely can invest in an entire car factory, but once you disarticulate production, subcontractors can raise the investment for making car seats or smaller parts of the cars. An important aspect that these firms, these big transnational firms that essentially own the intellectual property to a car, design of a car, don't necessarily have to invest in its production, and therefore their risk in manufacturing is much lower. Profit margins for the transnational firms ballooned even as growth rates, particularly in the West, typically stagnated. So that was the economic part of. Now you see, I'm working out the age of austerity. We've been through the technological side, we've been through the political side, economic, and now the fourth, the social aspect. These transnational firms and their subcontracted entities began a decade-long tax strike. The money that they made was squirreled away in tax havens. The Tax Justice Network estimates that the total amount of wealth hidden in tax havens is $32 trillion. That's $32 trillion, an amount that is worth 4.5 times the total value of gold that has ever been mined and is in circulation anywhere in the world. So it's 4.5 times the total value of gold above ground. That amount of money is sitting in tax havens, $32 trillion. And that's what I call a tax strike. In other words, the global bourgeoisie has gone on strike against civilization by secreting $32 trillion in tax havens. The removal of so much social wealth, so much privately accumulated surplus value from social production came at the same time as governments, mainly under pressure from the US Treasury Department, pushed against deficit spending and for balanced budgets. With less tax revenue coming in and with a wall against deficit spending, states with various political orientations had to make massive cuts which were not made on military spending but which were made on the social side. Because now your tax revenues are less, because you have to balance your budget, you are then forced to make cuts rather than make cuts, say, against the military, against the police, against corporate subsidies, and so on. Uh, because of the kind of class character of the state, the cuts were made on the social side. The entire world of care, healthcare, education, elder care, poverty alleviation, disability care, and so on, the entire world of care saw the most substantial cuts. That's number four, social. Number five, austerity. The world of austerity fractured society, putting enormous pressure on whatever social forms were able to survive capitalism's undermining of institutions of community. I mean, the point is that capitalism, in its very systemic way, in a very systemic way, undermines institutions of community, pushes atomization, individualization, and so on, including individualized understanding of consumption, of the self being perhaps mediated through, or the self's joy being mediated through commodities and so on. So, there was immense pressure put by austerity on whatever community structures remained, which had not been fully eroded by the normal process of capitalism. Protests were inevitable against the austerity. The so-called IMF riots that began in the 1970s, the first documented one in Lima, Peru in 1976, rattled the establishment. These riots would escalate into the 1980s, a particularly dangerous one for the managers of the world order in Indonesia in 1985. Tom Clausen of the Bank of America, who was the head of the World Bank from 1981 to 1986, ran the bank at the high point of these so-called IMF riots. He recognized their importance, and this is what he said. When people are desperate, you have revolutions, he said. It is in our evident self-interest to see that they are not forced into that. Then there's a very important line that comes next. He says, it's in our interest of the managers of the world, not to allow people to rise up. And then he says, you must keep the patient alive because otherwise you can't effect the cure. You must keep the patient alive because otherwise you can't effect the cure. There was no indication that the policy of impoverishment and plunder should change, only that the volume of the theft should not motivate unrest. In other words, austerity and pillage went hand in hand. Part 3, care. I'm going to now talk a little bit about the question of what's happening in South America, where I've been reporting a lot from, particularly Chile, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Argentina. But I'm specifically going to talk about Bolivia and Venezuela. Care, part 3. It is admitted, because it is foolish to deny it, that women are at the center of the protests in Bolivia against the coup against Evo Morales and for the restoration of the Morales government. In Venezuela as well, the majority of people who take to the streets to defend the Bolivarian revolution are women. There is a straight line from the Anganwadi Union and the Asha Union in India to these women in Bolivia and Venezuela. The main difference is that in Venezuela and Bolivia, the revolutionary process had advanced into state power. Most of the women in Venezuela and Bolivia who are on the streets might not be members of the movement to socialism, which is the party of Evo Morales. They might not be Chavistas in Venezuela, but they certainly understand, and I've learned this in my interviews with them and interaction with them, but they certainly understand that these revolutionary processes are feminist, socialist, and against the indignity visited upon the indigenous and the Afro descendants. Countries like Venezuela and Bolivia, Ecuador and Argentina faced immense pressure from the IMF through the 1980s and 1990s to make deep cuts, very deep cuts, in state support for healthcare, education, and elder care. The breakdown of these crucial state support systems put a burden on the care economy, which is largely maintained for patriarchal reasons by women. Um, it was the experience of the cuts in the care economy that deepened the radicalization of women in these societies. Their feminism emerged from their experience of patriarchy and structural adjustment policies together. Capitalism's tendency to harness violence and deprivation hastened the journey of working class and indigenous feminism directly into the socialist projects of Chavez and Morales. As the tide of neoliberalism continues to wash over the world and as it engulfs society in anxiety and heartache, it is women who have been the most active in the fight for a different world. Morales and Chavez are both men, but in the revolutionary process, they have come to symbolize a different reality for all of society. To different degrees, their governments have committed themselves to a platform that addresses both the culture of patriarchy and the policies of social cuts that burden women with holding society together. The revolutionary processes in Latin America, therefore, must be understood as deeply cognizant of the importance of putting women, the indigenous and Afro descendants, at the center of the struggle. No one would deny that there are hundreds of errors made by the governments, errors of judgment that set back the fight against patriarchy and racism. But these are errors which can be rectified and not structural features of the revolutionary process, whereas they are indeed structural features of austerity capitalism. That is something that is deeply acknowledged by indigenous and Afro descendant women in these countries. The proof of this acknowledgement is not in this or that article that they have written, but by their active and energetic presence on the streets. As part of the Bolivarian process in Venezuela, women have been essential in rebuilding social structures eroded by decades of austerity capitalism. Their work has been central to the development of people's power and for the creation of participatory democracy. 64% of the spokespersons of the 3,186 communes are women. 65% of the leaders in the local supply and production committees are women. Women not only demand equality in the workplace, but demand equality in the social domain, where the communes are the atoms of Bolivarian socialism. Women in the social domain have fought to build the possibilities of self government, building dual power, and therefore slowly eroding the form of the liberal state. Against austerity capitalism, women have shown their creativity, their strength, and their solidarity, not only against neoliberal policies, but also for the socialist experiment and against the United States led hybrid war. Finally, the last section is called Ends. In 1928, the German Marxist Walter Benjamin wrote an essay called Travels Through German Inflation. In it, he pointed out that the need of the hour, when economic collapse presaged civil war and international war, the need of the hour was to turn the emotional register of the vast mass of the people from despair to protest. The suffering of the German people, he wrote, must no longer open onto the precipitous road of grief, but instead onto the ascending path of revolt. This was easier said than done, for that transformation required the effort of political organization. It would not take place spontaneously. More than anything, Benjamin worried in these years about the fixation on growth rates and manufacturing quotas, the intensity of the belief that capitalist production could solve the problems of despair and deprivation. Revolutions, Benjamin said, should not be seen as an ever accelerating train. Perhaps revolutions are not the train ride, he wrote in his unpublished Arcades, but the human race grabbing for the emergency brake. Thank you very much.